seed, post-seed, Series A, Series B, convertible notes, and priced rounds. Common versus preferred shares and stock options. The fundraising process for a startup requires a crash course on some terminology that you've probably never heard of before. There's no evil corporation law firm making it confusing on purpose, like banks and credit cards. This is just a very complex topic that requires an understanding of some legal and financial terminology. When companies have such vast potential like startups, and when you deal with such large sums of money, everybody wants protection to make sure their time or their cash investments are safe. To better explain all of this, we're going to tell the story of a startup company, a theoretical startup company, from funding to IPO. So this is Startup Funding Explained, Part 1 of I don't know how many. Starting the company. Okay, so let's take a classic scenario. Two founders get together to start a business. They bring nothing but their skills and an idea, so they decide to split the company 2 ways. We have a video on that, so check it out. Incorporating a business is expensive, plus there are the tax and legal burdens of having a corporation. So these founders decide to hold off on that for now. They both have day jobs and are building the product in their free time, so they seek out some capital to speed things up. At this stage, they can't go to venture capitalists or they can't even go to angel investors. The money they can raise at this point needs to come from friends and family. So it turns out they have a close friend who believes in them and is willing to invest $50,000 in the business. Great. So now what? So this is where a corporation is going to be necessary. A Delaware C corporation is the most standard type of legal structure you can use, and most investors in the US will want that. We have a video on the process of incorporating, and we'll also link that in the description. So this corporation allows the founders and the investor to agree on the terms of ownership and the decision making for the business. It provides a layer of protection. For example, in case the company gets sued, that lawsuit doesn't necessarily translate into a liability for the founders or the investors. So, a corporation is made up of shares. We are more used to hearing about the percentage of ownership. Still, in legal terms, ownership is not represented by a percentage, but by an actual integer number of shares. People own a given number of shares of the business, which therefore represents a percentage of the total shares the company has issued. In the simplest of terms, you can have a corporation with just 1 share. Whoever owns that share owns 100% of the company. Our 2 founders, for example, could incorporate the business with 2 shares, 1 for each. 1/2 of all the shares represents 50% ownership. The problem with such small number of shares is that splitting them up is hard, and this will represent issues if they want to give shares to investors or to their team. That's why most companies are established with 10 million shares of stock, which provides enough pieces of the company to be able to split the corporation with plenty of people without having to worry about decimal numbers and rounding up or down. Okay, so we'll get back to shares in a second. Valuation. Let's remember our investor. He's willing to put $50,000 into the business. How many shares does he get? That question relates to how much the business is worth. Established companies typically base that valuation on the number of sales or the tangible assets they own, like cars or properties. But our 2 founders just have an idea and a few lines of code. At this point, it's a matter of agreeing on something that feels fair to the investor and to the founders. Those numbers can vary a great deal, but let's use 20% for this example. That's not out of the ordinary for a friends and family investor. The founders and the investor agree that he will invest $50,000 in exchange for 20% of this new business. If 20% of the company is worth $50,000, then that means that 100% of the company is worth $250,000. That is the effective business valuation. In this case, $250,000 is it's really just an arbitrary number. It's the 20% that showed that balance of risk reward that the investor was willing to accept. However, that valuation number will be much more relevant in future rounds of funding. Back to incorporation. So, to accept this money, a corporation will be established. Again, we want to use the $10 million share standard. In the most basic of terms, here's what's going to happen. A corporation will be established with 8 million shares total, 4 million shares for each founder. The company will define an arbitrary number of how much the shares are worth. Usually, at the get-go, that's going to be $100 for the whole company. So that's 0.00000125 per share. At this point, the owners own 50% of the company each. That means each of their chunks is worth $50. This transaction uses such a low number to avoid any extra tax complications. Now for the investment. The company is going to issue 2 million new shares to their investor. Issuing shares means that the company will create new shares. The number of shares each one of the founders has is going to remain unchanged. This is very important. By issuing 2 million new shares of stock, the company now has a total of 10 million total shares issued. That's a beautiful round number. The 4 million shares each founder had has remained unchanged. The difference is they used to represent 50% of the total number of shares, and now they just represent 40% of the total number of shares. Once again, shares didn't change hands. Nobody gave shares to the investor. The company issued new shares. Now, this is all done simultaneously, by the way. All you founder will see at the end of the whole process is just a bunch of paperwork and a slot to sign. But it's all done within the scope of probably one business day. Now, all the intellectual property, that's the code that the founders have written, and the assets, like the logos and designs, will now be owned by the company, which means everybody legally owns those assets in the agreed proportion of the share distribution. Great. Now, the investor will also want some protection in case one of the founders decides to leave. If one of the founders left, 40% of the intellectual property and the assets would be owned by someone who no longer works for the business. That's where vesting comes in. So, in a nutshell, a vesting agreement says that each one of the founders will only own their assigned shares after a certain period of time. A typical agreement has a 1-year cliff and a 4-year period with monthly installments. So, the total number of shares that the founder is supposed to own will be divided into 48 months, 4 years. During months 1 through 12, no shares are assigned to the founder. On month 12, 12 months worth of shares, so that's 1/4 of the total, are vested. That means that founder owns them. After that, 1/48 of the total number of shares gets assigned at the end of each month. For our founders, that means that by the time they work on the company for 1 full year, they will unlock 1 million shares. The remaining shares will be unlocked at the end of each calendar month to around 83,333 shares per month. Now, spoiler alert, in this hypothetical company scenario, one of the founders is going to leave before their shares are fully vested. We'll get a chance to calculate that in next week's episode. Hit that subscribe and we'll see you next week.